Hello, everybody. Today we are going to discuss dual circulation economic strategy. That is the latest hot topic in China. So, first of all, I myself, Charles, would go through an introduction on what is dual circulation, and Blaine would take over and also give you a little bit on the background on why this strategy is being brought up and the theory behind it. Last but not least, Jason would also talk about the implication and challenges that China will face in implementing this strategy. So first of all, what is dual circulation? It was first mentioned during the Politburo meeting in May 2020. So that is right after China starting to get a hand on the COVID situation in China. People start, the Chinese population start getting back to their normal life. That's when this term started to pop up until it become clear it is the next big thing in China when it's being confirmed as the core of the 14th five-year plan for China. This five-year plan is crucial to China's overall economic development every 5 years. So you can imagine this is going to be the core theme for the next 5 years when it comes to development and economic planning. So basically, there's two circulation. First of all is the internal circulation. The other one is the external, or also called international circulation. So as per the official definition, both circulation work on their own, but also complementing each other. So there would be a balance between self-sufficiency and also opening up, and they will keep opening up, and the internationalization will still be going. The domestic circulation doesn't mean door is closed. So the internal circulation focus on primarily on boosting domestic consumption. So as per the official definition, is trying to develop a new development model for China. And in the past 30 years, ever since the opening up, China's economic model has been based on exporting. And at one point, the international circulation was as high as 60% of the internal circulation, but it has since been gradually falling back to 37% recently. So there is a need for China to start looking for a new economic model. And on top of that, there's other reason as well, and Blaine will take you through more in details. So as mentioned, the internal circulation primarily focusing on boosting consumption. It has been an ongoing issue for China as consumption is lagging behind while the saving rate is very high. In a way, high saving rate is good, but it also signals the lack of consumption, which China has been trying to solve the problem, but without much progress until recently. The external environment is providing the perfect tailwind for repushing the domestic consumption because of the whole COVID situation and also the geopolitical tension with neighbor countries and EU and the US. So there is some good environment being created to repush this increased consumption. In order to do that, it's important to improve the household income because without income, there's no consumption. And China is trying to do it by expanding the middle class population. They have to speed up the urbanization, reform on the land and hukou system, but also looking after the poverty to make sure the overall population can enjoy such a household income improvement. And another key puzzle in this internal circulation is the supply chain upgrade. China, although is already very sophisticated in its supply chain, there's some core component they're still lacking and relying on foreign import. So they are mainly food, energy, and high-tech components such as semiconductors, which we all know already. But the recent data from the European Union Parliamentary Research Service just confirm how dire the situation is. So once the supply chain upgrade has been completed, another way to boost domestic consumption is by upgrade or revitalizing or upgrading the industrial manufacturing capacities. So trying to push China up in the global value chain when it comes to manufacturing. More high-tech, high-end manufacturing would ensure high income for the general population, and it would also have a swift change for China in the whole global supply and value chain. So as mentioned earlier, it's not just about internal circulation. There is the international part as well, although not as important as it used to be, but it's still there. They still need it, especially to complement the internal circulation. Because they have to maintain the export market share, since the export sector is still employing a lot of the population. It just can't be taken away. And also the capital market needs to be further opened up in order to get more FDI, more market competition to push through the structural reform. And it also serves China's geopolitical interest to remain open up and participate in the global affairs. So as mentioned before, the international circulation can help the structural reform a lot, which is crucial. The structural reform is needed in order to achieve the internal circulation goals, such as improving the general household income, and also the industrial manufacturing upgrade, things like that. It requires market force competition in order to solve the existing efficiency problem, and not to mention capital as well. FDI is still needed. So that's why international circulation will serve the internal circulation as well. All right, and Blaine will take over from here. Thank you.
And now for part 2, Background and Theory by Blaine Sapelli. Now, this is about China's geopolitical economic history. China is a large, diverse country, and historically it has been very difficult to keep it unified as a political entity. One of the key drivers of China's instability has been economic inequality between the coasts and the interior. When China is open to the world, the coastal areas get very wealthy, but the interior remains poor. The economic and political interests of the coastal regions tend to align with the interests of foreign merchants. These clashing interests and economic inequality harm the social, political, and economic stability of the country. We can tie this into theory here, specifically Marxist political economy, right? The economic and political interests of the coastal regions aligns with the interests of foreign merchants. This is consistent with Marxist ideas that the wealthy form an international class that works across national boundaries at the expense of working people in all societies. So how do we solve this problem? Going back to this economic and political problem. In the past, China has tried to solve it by shutting down the borders. This happened in the 15th century under the Ming Dynasty, and also more recently under Mao Zedong. While this does create internal stability, the strategy creates its own problems. Without international trade of goods and the exchange of ideas, China stagnates economically, scientifically, and technologically. Over time, the country becomes vulnerable to external threats and foreign domination. These negative effects are consistent with theories of economic liberalism. Liberalism argues that interconnections and global trade creates win-win scenarios and facilitate the building of wealth and technology transfers. So by not having them, China will lose out on all of these things. So how do we solve this paradox? Perhaps the problem in China's case is its unique geography. China's border regions are poorly integrated into the heart of the country. It's easier, or at least more economically efficient and profitable, for the coast to trade with the other side of the world than with the western half of China. In this case, infrastructure projects like the Go West campaign and the Belt and Road Initiative can help increase internal economic unity. If trade within China is easier, then trade with the outside world will become less destabilizing. There's more to this. China needs to boost internal consumer demand and production as part of a more equitable development strategy. It also needs to invest in strategic, high technology sectors to create a more even playing field in international trade. We see this in the form of Made in China 2025, as well as the new dual circulation policy. I like this graphic we have here. This ties into the theory of economic nationalism. Dual circulation also serves an important geopolitical function. It protects China from the other dangers of international trade, such as over-reliance on foreign technology and imports. This fits with an economic nationalist view of the world, where China's economy must be measured in relation to its competitors and not just in absolute terms. They would rather sacrifice a little economic growth for economic security. Economic nationalists would argue that economic, political, and military power are fundamentally inseparable, that the world order is an anarchic system, and that in case of conflict, China needs some level of self-sufficiency, right? The ability for the internal market to separate from the rest of the world to some degree, in case of emergency. Now, is this neo-mercantilism? Mercantilism is a policy of maximizing exports and minimizing imports. It assumes that global trade is a zero-sum game. It shares a lot of assumptions about the world with economic nationalism. Now, the problem with mercantilism is that if one country does it, other countries will retaliate in kind, and it will create isolated trading blocks and deglobalization, right? This is a trade war. So if the specifics of dual circulation are aggressive enough in their import substitution and export promotion measures, then it can be considered a form of neo-mercantilism. However, this remains to be seen. It depends on the specifics and what choices China makes in the future. And with that, let's move on to our next section, implications and challenges.
Thank you, Blaine. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the implications and challenges facing China when implementing the dual circulation strategy. So I want to start by highlighting the fact that the dual circulation strategy is not something that is completely new. Instead, China has been talking about rebalancing the economy from towards the domestic consumption for quite some time. So what is new about this dual circulation strategy is the change in external environments. So the trading environment has turned so negative that China has to find some new strategies to fight this so-called protracted war. The whole idea of DCS is about increasing the resilience of Chinese economies. It also sends a strong signal to external party that this time, amid the COVID-19, China is not going to use the old way of investment-led stimulus to boost the economy anymore. So what are the implications of increasing resilience? Some of these points were already covered by Charles. I'm not going to go into very details. I just want to highlight the second point, supply side reform. So during the pandemic, China observed that some of the more developed countries, their weakness in manufacturing capabilities. Some of these countries, they were even unable to produce the mass for domestic use. They think that these countries, they have oversold too much by moving up too much of the value chain into the service-based economies. Instead, China will want to stay at the very top of the value chains. And regarding the third point, outward investment, because China is going to put more focus on domestic investment, so it will result in less resources available for outward FDIs. So that's why we think China will likely move from a more expansionist approach in the past to a more targeted outward FDI policies. That will focus on sectors that are in line with its overall strategies. And some analysts may have the concern that does that mean China is going to close its store? We think is not true. China is not going to close its door because China has benefited enormously from opening up in the past. External sector is still very important to China, accounting for over 30% of GDP. And apart from that, a closed door policy really go against its strategy of increasing China's geopolitical influence and the grand strategy of national rejuvenations. So to sum up, we think that China is going to evaluate the linkage on a case-by-case basis. So if international linkage creates vulnerabilities, then China is going to minimize the exposure. But if linkage creates a leverage to China, then instead China is going to expand the connections. And because of the size of China, a slightly tweaks in economic policy of China can have a huge impact on investment and trade flows. So we broadly divided the countries into two groups. So for those countries that produce goods that where China is capable to produce, they're likely to face keen competition from China. But however, for advanced countries, they may be less impact initially because the Chinese firm, they are still unable to compete directly with these countries. But when China moves up gradually moves up the value chains, they may start to face increasing competition from China. So some research has tried to quantify the impacts of the whole import substitution on these countries. So they try to combine two things. On one hand is they try to estimate the exposure of each of these countries to a potential import substitution policy in China. And another is they try to estimate the vulnerability of this country in each sectors to Chinese competitions. And combining the two, the result shows that Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore are the top three countries that stand to lose most. However, we think the research is a little bit too conservative because it assumes a complete import substitution, which we think is not what China really wants, because China will want at least one alternative source for vital products. As a result, a complete import substitution will just run against the whole idea of resilience. Then what will the future globalization looks like? I think this graph picture very well the future's globalization. The future globalization may consist of three trading blocks: the American bloc, the Europe bloc, and also the Asia blocks. So China will becomes the centers of the Asia blocks, the demand center and supply centers. So on one hand, it will rely on its own domestic circulation, but on the other hand, there will also be a cooperation with other countries, like for example, the more innovative countries like Japan and South Korea on technologies. They may also rely on, they may also import some of the low value added goods from Eastern Europe. And finally, I'm going to talk about the challenges China is going to face if it implements its DCS. First of all, the whole idea of external circulation and internal circulation is based on the dialectic framework. So by dialectic framework, it means that China has to strike a very difficult balance between the domestic resilience on one hand and increasing its geopolitical influence on the other hand. So in other words, China will need to may need to make a difficult trade-off between the external and internal circulations. And the second challenge is related to China's favor towards economic statisms. So if you look at the graph on the left, on the right, so in terms of R&D expenditures, China, the government account for a big portion of the R&D expenditures. So these the big roles of governments in R&D can create the problem of overcapacity or inefficiency or wasteful investment, and it may also create some risk of policy mistakes that can be costly to China. And the third one is related to institutional challenge and interest group oppositions. These institutional challenge, for example, like the banking sectors in China has a strong bias towards SOEs. So these are the challenges that China has to think about and really overcome. So if it really want to move to a more new growth models. And finally, any of these structural change are costly to China. So in the past, China has been focused much on economic growth. They tend to use some kind of short-term measures like investment in infrastructure to boost growth instead of some long-term policy, social policy like healthcare or educations. But these are really the policy that need if China want to achieve new growth models. However, like in this year, China has abandoned its growth target. I think this may serve as a signal that China may be more determined this time to move towards a more quality growth model. I think this concludes the end of our presentation. So thank you so much for your attention.